The year is 1890. Western Nebraska lies open and raw, a horizon so flat it's swallow sound. The wind carves grooves into skin and memory alike. On these plains, survival isn't a matter of strength. It's a matter of stubbornness. 5 years earlier, Lars Eriksson stepped off a wagon into this very wind. A Norwegian by birth and a homesteader by choice, he carried nothing remarkable, except a box of seeds that no one else wanted. He had come for land. Like thousands swept westward by the promise of the Homestead Act, he believed in the dream. 160 acres, free, if only he could outlast 5 years of work, weather, and isolation. The land he claimed near Ogallala didn't look like much. Flat, treeless, silent but for the moan of wind through tall grass. No shade, no welcome, only potential, and the risk that came with it. Lars had sailed from Trondheim in the spring of '85 with his wife Ingrid, 2 trunks and a carved wooden box that had been passed down through generations. Inside were seeds that no American farmer would touch. Mangowurzels, kohlrabi, turnips, rutabagas, and a strange tuber called Jerusalem artichoke. This box, his father had said, will feed you when the wheat won't. At the time, it sounded like folklore, Norwegian superstition carried across oceans. Still, Lars listened. He didn't speak much, but he remembered everything. He built a sod house, dug a well, split the land into rows. Like every settler, he planted corn and wheat, hoping for yield. But he kept 10 acres separate, set aside for the strange, unwanted roots of his homeland. It was a private act, a hedge against failure, one that came with no guarantees but carried generations of wisdom. The early years offered no crisis. Between 1885 and 1889, the plains were generous. Rain came, crops grew. The wheat waved golden in the summer sun. Prices were good. Confidence swelled. Neighbors looked at Lars's root patch and laughed. Henry Caldwell, a broad-shouldered settler from Ohio, called them pig crops and said so to Lars's face. You'll never sell any of that. This is America. We grow real food. Lars didn't argue. Every fall, he harvested his 10 acres in silence, cleaned the roots, packed them in sand, labeled barrels with chalk, stored them deep underground in a hand-dug cellar that stayed cold all year. He didn't grow them to sell. He grew them because the land forgets promises and the sky forgets rain. The settlers, though, trusted slogans. Rain follows the plow was the popular saying. Land agents and railroad men repeated it like gospel. Farmers believed the very act of settlement would summon clouds and soften the soil. Then came 1890. The sky stayed dry. Weeks passed without a drop. The wheat, once eager and green, now stunted by June. Corn never tasseled. The soil, stripped of prairie grass, turned to powder. The wind carried it away. Dust rolled across the plains like a slow-moving tide. It coated everything. It crept into lungs, into dinner plates, into dreams. The horizon disappeared behind brown haze. Days ended in a choking silence. Wells ran dry. Cattle ribs showed. Hens stopped laying. Gardens failed. Trees dropped their leaves before the frost even arrived. By midsummer, neighbors were knocking, not asking for handouts, but to borrow tools, to talk, to count the number of barrels Lars had stored. Some packed wagons and fled east. Most stayed. Pride is hard to move once it's rooted. In his cellar, Lars kept watch. There were barrels enough, 40 tons by his estimate, packed with care, labeled in neat hand. Each night he descended into that dark, cool air with a lantern. He ran fingers across barrels of yellow mangels, purple rutabagas, knobby artichokes, food that smelled of earth and old wisdom. He hadn't planted for them. But hunger changes things. Neighbors stopped laughing when the store in Ogallala emptied, when Henry Caldwell's cattle died in the heat, when whispers of suicide moved through the town like wind through dry stalks. The community gathered for one last meeting before the first snows. Inside the church, voices cracked with desperation. Some spoke of stealing grain from government stores. Others talked of fleeing. No one had solutions. Then Lars stood. "I have food," he said, voice flat as the plains. The room fell still. "My wheat failed like yours. My corn is dead, but my cellar is full." He offered his harvest. Roots, they called them, pig food. But not that day. That week, the county mobilized. 47 families, shovels, baskets, worn hands. They came to Lars's land and dug, men, women, children. Dust in their eyes, mud under fingernails, sweat falling into the cracked soil. And from that soil came roots, turnips the size of fists, rutabagas like cannonballs, mangelwurzels so large 2 men were needed to carry them, Jerusalem artichokes that grew in tangled knots like forgotten treasure. They packed barrels, inventoried cellars, built shelves, traded labor for food. They called it the root bank. No money, no pride, just survival. They didn't love the taste, but it was food. It was nourishment. It was life. What they had mocked, they now measured carefully by weight. What they had scoffed at, they now divided among children. 2 pounds per adult, 1 per child. Enough to hold off winter, enough to reach spring. Something had changed in them, not just in their diets, but in how they looked at the land. They learned that life didn't always come from above the ground. Sometimes it was the unseen that saved you. Roots grow down. They reach where others can't. They find water in places forgotten. They don't ask for praise, they endure. What Lars had planted wasn't just insurance, it was memory, passed down in seed. A survival story stored underground, waiting for the right moment. When the first frost came, the wind howled but found no quit in Keith County. Inside each home, roots simmered in kettles, mashed into porridges, fried in pans with precious pinches of salt. Children chewed what once made them laugh. Elders whispered prayers with full mouths. They warmed each other by fires fed with shared wood. They learned to barter differently, with effort, with care, with presence. A boy who chopped wood for the elderly found a biscuit on his doorstep. A widow who sang hymns by heart was invited to every table. They passed the winter not in abundance, but in solidarity. They taught each other how to make do with what had once been discarded. They recorded recipes on scraps of paper and shared them. 1 root, 100 ways, a stew of rutabaga and salted rabbit. Mangelwurz mashed thickened with cornmeal. Jerusalem artichoke, fried crisp with lard. These were not delicacies. They were declarations. We are still here. And they were. In the silence between storms, in the brittle light of January, in the way hands reached for hands, there was something stronger than the cold. The land had turned its back, but the roots had not. And for that, they owed their lives to a man who listened to the old ways, who planted what others mocked, and who believed that some things, like seeds and people, were meant to survive, not for glory, not for gain, but for each other. Part 2. The Drought Years. In the spring of 1890, the wind shifted. It didn't howl louder. It didn't carry fire. It simply stopped bringing rain. And in Nebraska, that's how a disaster begins, not with a flood, but with silence. The fields that had once rolled green under wheat and corn now turned brittle. What had been rows of promise became rows of regret. The rains missed March, then April. By May, they were still gone. The clouds drifted high and white, uninterested. At first, the settlers in Keith County waited. That was what farmers did. You didn't panic at the first dry spell. You believed. You watched the skies. You prayed. You told each other it would pass. But it didn't. By June, the wheat stood only a few inches high. The sun baked it yellow. The roots curled under the surface like fists refusing to unclench. The corn, planted in May, barely broke the soil. By July, it was dead. The drought arrived not as a single moment, but as an accumulation of absence. Each day without rain was a nail. By midsummer, the coffin was nearly shut. The prairie grass, stripped to make room for farms, had once held the earth in place. But now, without it, the topsoil dried and cracked. The wind, always present on the plains, picked it up in angry gusts. Dust storms began. Not the towering black walls that would define the 1930s, but their cruel forerunners. Clouds of fine soil rolled across the land, swallowing fences, stinging eyes blackening the air. People wore scarves around their faces. Doors and windows were sealed with cloth and hope. But nothing stopped the dust. It lived in your lungs. It whispered while you slept. Ogallala's weather station recorded only 9.7 inches of rain that year, less than half the average. In July alone, temperatures hovered above 90 degrees for 22 straight days. Wells dried to a trickle. Streams vanished. Springs ran empty. The Platte River, that old artery of life, shrank into a shadow of itself. And with the drought came debt. Most families had borrowed to seed their fields. Confident in another good year, they mortgaged their land, their tools, their futures. Wheat had once sold at 80 cents a bushel. Now it was worth nothing because there was none to sell. Credit dried up with the water. Stores shut down. The local bank collapsed under unpaid loans. With no crops, there was no money. With no money, there was no food. With no food, there was only waiting. By September, the town was a husk. Horses stood thin-ribbed in dry corrals. Cattle were sold for pennies or slaughtered early, their meat salted and buried. Chickens laid less and less. Goats bawled and went silent. Families cooked whatever they could, ground corn husks, boiled weeds, wild onions if they could find them. A few lucky ones caught prairie chickens or rabbits. But the land was exhausted. It gave less and less. Hunger, always a quiet shadow, now stepped into the open. Men chewed bark. Women watered down flour into paste. Children slept more, their bodies conserving what little they had. Lars Erickson said little. He attended the church meetings where neighbors argued and pleaded, where Henry Caldwell and others looked like ghosts in boots, where some suggested heading east while others talked of stealing from government stores or rail shipments. But most of them knew there was nowhere else to go. Cities were no better. And the land, this land, was still theirs. The questions became immediate, brutal. Who will eat? Who will last? Who will freeze in December or starve in January? In the middle of that fear, a memory stirred, quiet and root-bound. Lars descended into his cellar, lantern in hand. The light flickered against barrels lined in rows like soldiers. He checked each one: turnips, rutabagas, mangelwurzels, Jerusalem artichokes, kohlrabi. Some had sprouted little white shoots. Others were firm and solid. All were food. He counted, measured, ran numbers in his head. 40 tons. Enough for his family. Enough for others, too, if rationed, if managed. That night, Lars walked home from the church meeting, the wind cold against his face. He didn't speak to Ingrid. He didn't need to. They had lived the same life, made the same sacrifices. When he finally did speak, it was only this: "We'll share it." Ingrid nodded once. And that changed everything. Word spread fast. The next morning, men and women showed up at the Erickson homestead. They didn't come with open hands, they came with shovels. They worked from sunup to sundown. The earth, despite the drought, still gave what Lars had planted. Root vegetables, deep-rooted, drought-resistant, stubborn as the people who now pulled them free. Turnips came up like fists, mangels like buried stones. The Jerusalem artichokes were tangled, awkward, but abundant. It was not gold, it was not wheat, but it was food. They washed the roots, sorted them, packed them in barrels. Sand was layered between them for preservation. Lars organized a rationing system, 2 pounds per adult, 1 per child, per day. Every Sunday after church, each family received their share. The plan was fair. Fairness was survival. In return, neighbors helped Lars finish the harvest. His 10 acres of root crops produced more food than most 160-acre wheat farms that year. What had been laughed at in the good times was now revered. Henry Caldwell, who had once mocked Lars in public, was the first to apologize. "I thought you were crazy," he said, shoulders slumped. "Turns out you were the only one planting for the bad years." Lars didn't reply. He didn't need to. They filled his root cellar. Then they filled theirs. And when those were full, they used the schoolhouse basement. They even borrowed space beneath the abandoned bank vault. Irony not lost on them. They called it the root bank. It was crude, but it was organized. One man oversaw inventory. Another managed sanitation. Ingrid and a few women shared cooking techniques, recipes, ways to make the food stretch, to make it taste like something worth eating. It wasn't bounty, but it was hope. They baked flatbreads from grated rutabagas, made thin stews with diced turnips, fried Jerusalem artichokes in pork drippings, when drippings could be spared. They learned to roast mangelwurzels until sweet. No feast, but enough. In that hopeless fall, the community of 47 families reorganized itself, not around crops or cash, but around calories. The root crops became currency. Labor was traded for meals, services for rations. Everything was weighed. The schoolteacher got extra for feeding the children lunch. The old trapper who could still snare rabbit was treated like a king. That winter, they would not feast, but they would not fall. And it all began with a cellar full of pig food, planted by a man who remembered where he came from. The winter of roots. By November of 1890, Nebraska had become a prison of ice and silence. The first storm arrived like a final breath. Cold, weighty, and relentless. 2 feet of snow fell in one night, swallowing fences, barns, and wagon paths. By dawn, the prairie was gone, buried under a white hush that muffled every sound but the wind. The sun came up weak and pale, casting no warmth, only the knowledge that this was just the beginning. For the 47 families of Keith County, it marked the start of a long, cruel test. The blizzards came often. Bitter winds howled like wolves through the cracks in sod houses. Frost crawled across walls inside homes. Wells froze. Doors warped from moisture. Everything that could break, broke. The land offered no comfort, no refuge. It simply endured and dared them to do the same. And the food? It would have been gone weeks before the first snowfall had it not been for the roots. The root bank. Lars Ericsson's cellar, once mocked by neighbors as a monument to backward thinking, now held 40 tons of strange salvation. Barrels of turnips, rutabagas, kohlrabi, mangels, and Jerusalem artichokes packed in sand. Root crops that had survived the summer's drought now stood between life and death. On November 14th, Lars began distribution. He wheeled the first barrel into the church, one of the only buildings still standing firm. It was cold and dark inside, but it had shelter, a stove, and faith. Each family sent one representative. They stood in line holding burlap sacks, baskets, even pillowcases. 2 pounds per adult, one per child, per day, Lars announced. Weekly rations. That's what the cellar can hold. No one argued. No one needed to. The root diet began that night, eating to endure. The meals were plain, but they filled the stomach. Turnip stew, rutabaga mash, boiled kohlrabi with a sprinkle of salt. Jerusalem artichokes, fried in the last of the bacon grease. When they had it, a splash of milk or a bit of lard made it almost pleasant. Ingrid Eriksson, with sleeves rolled and hair pinned back, became the winter's unlikely hero. She held weekly gatherings with other women, sharing recipes and techniques for preservation and preparation. She taught them to roast mangels for sweetness, mash them with vinegar, or pickle thin slices of kohlrabi to break the monotony. And still, it was hard. Children cried for bread, for meat, for anything else. They scratched drawings of cakes in the frost on windows. They dreamed aloud of eggs and sausages. Adults hid their despair better, but it showed in their eyes. They weren't starving, but they were hungry, for more than food, the bitter middle. December gave way to January, and the worst of the cold arrived. Temperatures dropped to 30 below. Snow buried entire cabins. Chimneys clogged with ice. Doors had to be dug open each morning. A man named Samuel Gentry froze to death trying to reach his livestock. Another, Claire Dawson's husband, collapsed while cutting wood. He survived, but lost 3 fingers. Inside, life was muted. Days bled into nights, fires burned low. Families spoke in whispers. Everything slowed. But still, every Sunday they met at the church. Through waist-deep snow, they trudged with sleighs and sleds, exchanging greetings without smiles. They collected their weekly rations and prayed silently. No one missed a week. They called it the Root Bank. It became not just a source of food, but a covenant, a symbol, a bond, a new kind of wealth. Lars's system worked because it was fair, transparent. He kept tallies with chalk on the wall, traded favors for labor. If someone fell sick, others stepped in. If a child needed more, they got it. By late January, the root stores began to thin. Half the barrels were gone. A few spoiled, some were sprouting in the damp. But the families adapted. They built their own root cellars, mimicking Lars's design. They rotated storage, pickled more, boiled less. Waste was a sin. Henry Caldwell, once the loudest critic, now stood beside Lars during rationing. He even built a shed next to his barn for future root harvests. Never again, he muttered one night, splitting mangels by lamplight. Never again without these. Moments of grace. There were glimmers in the dark. A snowball fight between restless boys in the middle of a supply run. A fiddle played on Christmas Eve, echoing against the icy walls of the church. Ingrid baked flatbread with turnip flour and wild honey, just enough for each child to get a bite. They sang Silent Night. No decorations, no gifts, just warmth, breath, and survival. And they were grateful. One night in early January, a boy brought his sled into the church and began handing out drawings. Crayon sketches of turnips, artichokes, smiling barrels. "This one's Lars," he said proudly, pointing to a stick figure with a root in each hand. They pinned them to the wall with nails and twine. Those pictures stayed up long after the snow melted. February fractures. In February, rationing tightened. Children now received 3/4 of a pound daily. Adults got just over 1. Every barrel was inventoried, double-counted, and guarded. Tension crept in. 2 families argued over a missing sack. It turned out to be a counting error, but the damage lingered. A boy was caught taking extra rutabagas. He wasn't punished. Instead, the community pooled extra food and delivered it to his home in silence. Their survival depended on discipline, but also on mercy. A traveling minister arrived late that month. He carried news from the east of grain prices, failed banks, rail schedules. But he also brought hope. He told them that seed relief was coming, that government officials were taking notice, that they hadn't been forgotten. His sermon was short, his words simple. Keep your roots, keep your faith. The Melt March arrived with a whisper, a single day of thaw, then another. Then the air began to change. The wind softened. The birds returned. Streams cracked and gurgled to life beneath the snow. On March 21st, the temperature broke 40 degrees. Children ran barefoot through puddles. Men opened barn doors and shoveled roofs. Women stepped outside just to feel the sky. The worst was over. Aftermath. April brought work. The state sent seed. The railroad sent supply wagons. But this time, planting was different. Every family kept a plot for roots. What had once been called pig food was now insurance, dignity, memory. The community had survived because of roots and each other, and that was not a lesson they would forget. The roots had held them, but barely. By the final days of March 1891, the barrels were down to the dregs. Root hairs curled in damp sand. Mold crept over Jerusalem artichokes in the corners. The stench in some cellars was sour, bitter, fermentation, despair. Families were thin, cheekbones jutted out. Children moved slowly like small old people. Laughter came in whispers, if at all. They had survived the winter, but only just. And then, like a hand lifting from the chest, the thaw arrived. On the 21st day of March, the snow cracked open. Drips fell from eaves in rhythmic beats. The wind shifted, carrying the smell of wet earth. In the distance, the mighty Platte murmured as ice sheets broke and churned. That morning, a group of boys ran barefoot into the muddy fields and shouted to the sky. Their feet turned blue in the slush, but they didn't care. They were alive. The prairie was waking up. In early April, as the ground softened, a new kind of work began. Railroad companies and state officials had finally answered the winter's long silence. Trains brought seed, wheat, corn, barley, sorghum. Not enough to feed dreams, but enough to start over. Shovels bit into thawing ground. Hooves trampled last season's stubble. Farmers sowed with hands still raw from chopping frozen wood. But not all the fields were for corn. Nearly every family in Keith County set aside plots for roots. A strange transformation had taken place, quiet but absolute. Turnips, rutabagas, and Jerusalem artichokes now shared space with the once kingly wheat. They weren't emergency crops anymore. They were security. The prairie, for all its violence, remembered the hands that worked it. Come April, the land softened like a bruised animal. Grass returned in clumps. Shoots of green broke through where there had been only ash and dust months before. The families moved with purpose. They dug new cellars, deeper, drier, better built. Root storage had become a science. They lined walls with stone, ventilated ceilings, trained their sons how to bury sand-packed barrels and check for rot. In early May, Lars helped Henry Caldwell build a second storage room beneath his barn. The man who once sneered at pig food now planted 10 full acres of root vegetables. He had his boys memorizing recipes, identifying seed types by touch. "We'll never be caught again," he told Lars. Not like that. No one had to ask what he meant. The drought of 1890 was no longer a nightmare. It was a teacher, and from it came lessons. Monoculture was fragile. Diversity was survival. Modern advice could fail. Old country knowledge had its place, and no single farmer, no matter how proud, could outlast the prairie alone. The community began holding monthly meetings, this time not out of desperation, but planning. They shared preservation techniques. They traded root stock. They debated planting schedules. Lars Eriksson became the quiet authority, not by vote, by respect. When he spoke, others listened. By June, crops were growing. Not lush, not like before, but healthy, stable. The rains came in slow intervals, enough to hope, enough to risk. The general store in Ogallala reopened, stocked cautiously. Prices were still high, credit tight, but shelves no longer empty. More importantly, no one had left. All 47 families stayed, even after the winter, even after the hunger, even after the dreams had rotted in barrels alongside turnip peels. They stayed. And that meant something. A baby was born to the Dawsons in late July. They named her Hope. By summer's end, children were helping plant the fall root crop. They did it naturally, no longer mocking the misshapen vegetables. They'd lived on them, trusted them, named them. One boy started calling the Jerusalem artichokes prairie potatoes. The name stuck. They ate better now, traded when they could, preserved everything. Nothing went to waste. Even spoiled roots were fed to livestock, who, in turn, helped the fields. The cycle tightened. They had learned how to live with the land, not against it. In early autumn, a traveling preacher passed through town. He'd last been there the summer before. Back then, the church was half empty. The pews filled with silence and eyes that stared at the floor. This time, the building was full. The hymns were louder, the faces firmer. Even grief stood straighter. After the service, he asked what had changed. Roots, a woman said simply. In October, a letter came from the University of Nebraska's new agricultural station in Lincoln. A young professor had heard about the man with the root cellar in Keith County. He wanted to visit, to learn, to document. He arrived with paper, ink, and questions. Lars, wary of outsiders, took him into the cellar. "This saved us," he said, pointing to barrels stacked like treasure. "When the grain failed, these fed a county." The professor took notes. He called it the diversified survival method. He would later publish a paper on Lars's system, part memoir, part agricultural model. It was passed from hand to hand, cited in dry farming lectures, and quietly changed how some thought about Western farming. The prairie was different, not greener, not easier, but wiser. Root vegetables were now listed in planting schedules alongside wheat and corn. Farmers kept backup seed boxes. They dug cellars before barns. They passed down root recipes like family heirlooms. And beneath all of it was one simple truth. The land wouldn't change for them. So they had to change for the land. The children, who had eaten mangels for Christmas dinner, grew up never forgetting. When they farmed, they remembered the roots. And when the Dust Bowl came 40 years later, when other counties broke and scattered, Keith County held. Not perfectly, not without pain, but it held. Because someone, back in 1885, had carried a box of weird seeds across an ocean. Because someone listened to his father. Because someone trusted what grew beneath the surface. And because, when the time came, he shared it all. Lars became a name not just spoken in town, but written down in letters to cousins back east. He was the reason some stayed and others came. A quiet legend with dirt-stained hands and barrels full of salvation. By December, more letters arrived. The university invited Lars to contribute first-hand accounts for an agricultural almanac. He refused the spotlight, but sent notes, plain words, simple truths, enough to guide others. The cellar stayed full that winter, not from need, but from prudence. They didn't wait for crisis. They expected it. Prepared for it. Root festivals began the next year, informal gatherings where families displayed harvests, traded seeds, and shared new ways to cook old vegetables. Children carved turnips into lanterns. Teenagers competed to grow the heaviest mango. Songs were sung, stories told. And in every one, Lars was there, not always in person, but in memory, in the earth, in the roots. Keith County hadn't just survived, it had become something new, a place built not just on land, but on learning, on legacy, on the strange knotted wisdom buried beneath the frost. And through all seasons, one truth remained. The roots ran deep. The drought had passed, but its memory clung to Keith County like dust in a cellar crack. It wasn't just a season. They had lived through a test. And what followed was not a return to normal, but the birth of something new. The land had taught them that survival was not a right, but a craft. And that craft began with the seed. In the years that followed, farmers across western Nebraska began to diversify. No longer content to plant only wheat or corn, they began experimenting. Alfalfa took root. Sorghum rose in stiff green stalks. Barley was planted, its golden heads waving like the wheat once had. But the roots never left. They had proven themselves quiet, ugly, stubborn things that held against blight, wind, and fire. Now they were part of every homestead, part of every cellar, part of every plan. The University of Nebraska's Agricultural Extension Program began distributing literature on root storage methods. Farmers who once mocked peasant vegetables now compared yields and debated cooking methods. Lars Erickson became a regular contributor to the Nebraska Farmer, not by title but by invitation. His letters, written in plain language and short sentences, were reprinted statewide. Plant deep, save seed, build your cellar before your fence. They were more than tips, they were philosophy. He didn't call it resilience. He didn't call it biodiversity. He just called it farming. In 1892, he was elected to the County Agricultural Board. Reluctantly, he spoke little at meetings, but when he did, others sat quiet. He pushed for county-wide seed stockpiles, root vegetable cooperatives, and windbreak plantings. Trees were planted on the open plains, cottonwoods, elms, pines, meant not for lumber, but to slow the wind, catch the snow, and hold the land. It was a vision not of abundance, but of durability. Others called it dry farming. But in Keith County, it was just how things were done. By 1900, 20% of cultivated land in the region was devoted to alternative crops. The root cellar had gone from curiosity to cornerstone. Children were taught the names of vegetables that once brought laughter. Mangovurzels, Jerusalem artichokes, kohlrabi, rutabagas. They were given not just seeds, but stories. Your grandfather lived on this, a mother would say, handing a child a boiled slice of turnip. In schoolhouses, lessons included crop rotation schedules and soil retention techniques. Teachers passed out copies of a pamphlet. Lars helped draft, a simple guide to prairie survival. He called it, "For When the Rain Doesn't Come." The small wooden church became more than a gathering place. It hosted seed exchanges, food storage lessons, community meals built entirely from roots and prairie game. The tone had shifted. There was no more embarrassment in eating turnips. There was pride, there was memory, there was legacy. In 1903, a late spring hailstorm destroyed hundreds of acres of corn, but the cellars were full. No one panicked. In 1906, a fire swept across the edge of town. The root vegetables buried in the soil survived. They were dug up, dirty but edible, and shared. In 1909, a visiting agricultural official remarked, "Keith County has some of the healthiest rural children I've ever seen." Years later, in the 1950s, his story began appearing in textbooks, quietly, as a sidebar in a chapter on sustainable agriculture. But in Keith County, they didn't need books. They had the land, they had the cellars, they had the stories, and they had the roots. Every fall, school children still walk out to a patch of county land planted with turnips and rutabagas. They dig them by hand, learn their weight, taste their sweetness. Someone tells them about Lars, about a time when nothing grew but these strange, stubborn roots, about a man who didn't laugh at old ways, about the winter that nearly ended it all, and the seed that saved them. Sometimes they carry home a single root, like a relic, not because it's beautiful, but because it's true. No monuments, no museums, just dirt, sweat, and memory. And that's enough. Because in the end, the greatest harvest wasn't food. It was knowledge. And they never forgot.